So I'm kicking off a new series called Seasons of the Soul, and we're going to be looking at how, as Christians, we have different seasons in our walk with Jesus. Now, some of you are here going, Dave, there are seasons? No one told me there were seasons, because maybe you came to faith and you were expecting it to look a little bit like this, that as time goes by, it's an inevitable upward journey to becoming more like Jesus. Anyone here experiencing that in their Christian? Yeah, maybe a few of you, I don't know. This is a diagram of my Christian walk. So for me it looks a bit more like that, which might be a bit more familiar to many of you, that ultimately when you're following Jesus, there are ups, there are downs, there are all these different seasons to life. And we shouldn't be surprised, because the Bible's full of this example that there are going to be seasons. So for instance, in Ecclesiastes, the writer makes it clear there is a time for everything. There is a season for every activity under the sun. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down, a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. But there's always going to be these different moments as we go through our journey with Jesus. And so over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be looking at each of the seasons. And so, we're going to be looking at spring and how that's often about new birth, new things happening. Summer, about fruitfulness and flourishing. And then maybe as we look at autumn, how things change or end. And then in winter, the idea of silence and stillness. So today, I'm kicking off the series with winter. So we're going to be, sorry, it gets better as you get but we're starting with winter. And so, for many of us, the kind of winter in our walk with Jesus can happen for a lot of different reasons. There's many, many reasons why you might find yourself going through what feels like a bit of a winter time with Jesus. It can be due to failure and disappointment, it can be due to illness, disaster, tough times, or even you just get distracted sometimes. Life is busy and you just find yourself distracted by all the stuff of life, and actually you can begin to feel very disconnected from God. Now, what I wanted to say today as well is that when we talk about winter, let's not confuse it with depression or despair. What we're talking about rather is a spiritual sense of loss, that something in our relationship with God seems to have changed and we're not perhaps feeling as connected or as close to Him as we once were. Because depression and despair are something else. Now they might be linked, but I just want to encourage you, if you are struggling with depression or despair, then to really reach out, get some help. There's a lot of help out there. I'd encourage you to talk to your GP. So I'm not going to be talking so much about that, but rather a spiritual sense of loss. And this can be, for some people, either a spiritual crisis, something happens and suddenly they're feeling disconnected, or it can be just a gradual slowing down. You become more and more aware that maybe something's missing or something isn't the same anymore. Now the challenge is, in charismatic churches, we don't do winter very well, you see, because in charismatic churches, we're all about prayer and God answering prayer and God's nearness and the presence of God, and generally we're pretty upbeat about everything. So for us, in the charismatic branch of the church, if you like, generally speaking, we like to party, we like to have a good time, we like to talk about the good stuff in life. We don't like to dwell too much on some of the tougher stuff. And the reality of that is sometimes we slip into what I call fat boy slim theology. So fat boy slim theology is right here, right now. That effectively I want to experience everything that the kingdom of heaven has in store, but now. I'm not going to wait for any of it. I'm expecting it all to kick off right here, right now. Now, if you fancy a bit of a long word, this is what we call an over-realised eschatology. That ultimately you're expecting too much too soon. And so we live with the tension of the now and not yet of the kingdom of heaven. Now, the reality of that is when we come to a winter time in our lives, you might find it difficult to connect with writers or music that perhaps resonates with how you're feeling. And that again is to do with the fact that actually many other Christian traditions deal with this a lot better than us. So I would encourage you to cast your net a little bit wider than your usual places. That you might find, dare I say, even the Anglican Church might have something to say about this. Or the Catholic tradition, the Orthodox tradition. There are many other Christian traditions that deal with the winter of the soul far better than perhaps Pentecostal charismatic traditions have typically. So what I'm going to talk about today is, over the years of doing this job, leading churches, I've come across 3 main myths that people encounter when they go into a winter time in their spiritual life. And these 3 myths are, it's just me, God is gone, God has left me, or this is the end of my faith. This is the end. And so we're going to take each of these in turn. So the first one, it's just me. Often when someone hits spiritual winter time, they feel like it's just them. They're the only person in the church going through it, or their small group, and actually you feel very out of step with everybody else. And this can lead to you feeling very lost and disconnected. That ultimately you begin to believe actually you're the only one. And I would argue that Satan loves to isolate us, to kind of pick us off one by one. So the idea that these voices in your head that are telling you, no one else is going through this, it's just me, they wouldn't understand, they don't get it, isn't necessarily the right way to think about this. Because I want to encourage you to understand that you're not alone. You're not alone today, and you're not alone in the Christian tradition. Because this sense of lost disconnectedness you find throughout the Bible. The Psalms contain 1 in 3 of the Psalms is a psalm of lament. It's someone crying out to God, where are you? I don't understand why life is so hard at the moment. So if 1 in 3 of the Psalms is like that, surely we can take some encouragement from that, that ultimately I'm not alone. Others have experienced this before me. Famously, the psalmists often cry out in quite strong language about their feeling disconnected from God. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts, and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Athanasius, the church father, wrote about the Psalms, and he said, there is something in these Psalms for all of us. There's something in these Psalms that can connect with whatever's going on in your life at the moment. And I'd encourage you, if you are feeling in a winter time in your faith, then turn to the Psalms and you will find the words there that you perhaps can't find for yourself to express how you're feeling back to God. But when we think about winter, one of the things I want to encourage us about is a little bit of self-care. So the Danes have something called hygge. Everyone say after me, hygge?
Hygge.
Hygge, yeah. It sounds like the start of that song, hygge. No. Hygge. So hygge is what the Danes do in the long winter nights. And it starts with a bit of self-care. So if you are going through a tough time and a winter in your faith, don't assume you can keep up the same level of activity that you had been engaged in previously. That actually it's okay to slow down a little bit, to take things a little bit easier, to look after yourself a little bit. But the key thing that the Danes do with hygge as well is they don't just isolate. They get their friends round for meals and coffees. They connect. They spend time with good people. They try to laugh, have a good time. And so I'd encourage us all that if we start to go through this winter time, the first thing to do, not the last thing to do, is reach out. There are people who know you and who love you, who'd be very happy to come and get a coffee with you. And one writer makes the point. He said in his experience, 1 in 3 of the Psalms is of lament, and 1 in 3 of the members of his congregation are going through a tough time in any moment. So if you're going through a tough time and you're feeling disconnected and you're worried about reaching out to anyone, the reality is, in this room right now, there are either a third of the group currently going through tough times, but there are certainly more than a third of this group who've been through tough times and who can sit with you. And most importantly, listen. I am a sub-average pastoral visitor. I am not very good. I go round, I sit, I talk, I listen, I leave. Whether I've done any good is up to the individual. I've no idea. There are times when I think possibly not. But the reality is, what I need to remember is the key thing in that moment isn't me dispensing words of great wisdom. It's me being there. It's me listening, spending time. There's a really powerful book called Lament for a Son, written by Nicholas Wolterstorff. And he says this: if you think your task as comforter is to tell me that really all things considered it's not so bad, you don't sit with me in my grief, but place yourself off in the distance away from me. Over there, you're of no help. What I need to hear from you is that you recognise how painful it is. I need to hear from you that you are with me in my desperation. To comfort me, you have to come close. Come sit beside me. I was reading Job recently, and the thing about Job's, his mates start off brilliantly. They sit in the dust with him. If only they had stopped there. It only goes wrong when they start speaking. But up until that moment, as a pastoral visit goes, they were doing a really good job. They sat with Job in his grief, acknowledged his grief. It was only when they felt the need to try and talk him out of it that it goes horribly wrong. And I think there's something there for all of us to take heart about. Is if someone reaches out to you and says, can you come for a coffee? Don't go fearing you've got to come up with some brilliant answer to their problems or some deep theological insight. They're reaching out to you because they want you to sit, they want to spend time with you, and they want you to listen. And we can all do that. So I just want to encourage you, if you get that call, go and listen and sit with, rather than worrying about what you're going to say. But the other thing about being alone in the wintertime is people often disconnect from church. They feel like everyone else in church is fine and they're not, so therefore they stop going. And what I want to say to you today, if you're here or if you're watching online, is don't give up on church. When you go through a winter time in your faith, everyone looks like they're having a great time and they're finding it easy to praise. You don't know what's going on in people's minds, and remember the 1 in 3. There are other people in the room going through tough times as well. But they've chosen to turn up and be with people who love them. So that's the key thing I want you to know today, is if you're going through a winter, church, there are people who love you here. Don't disconnect from them. Be with them. Because there's one of the things that we want to make a commitment to as a group of churches going forwards, is we are going to be authentic. We want real, honest faith. And that means we need to be able to talk about the tough times as well as the good times. So that's the first point. Our second point, the second myth after being lost and disconnected, is the idea that God has left me, that he is gone. And this often happens when the great spiritual vending machine in the sky stops working for us. That ultimately we're putting in the prayers, but we're not getting the answers out the way that we want them or as quickly as we want them. And there's a fundamental issue here about our view of faith. Because the question is, when you chose to follow Jesus, was that because you wanted things to go well, or because you wanted him to be your Lord and for you to become more like him? Because they're different things. If you have an expectation that you're going to become more like Jesus, who did go through some very tough times, why are we surprised that it involves tough times for us? I had to check this slide with a friend of mine who is really into his moths. This is a true story. Apparently, a moth has to really struggle to get out of the cocoon. And the danger is if you try to help it at all, its wings won't be strong enough to enable it to fly when it finally emerges. There's something about the struggle that means it develops the necessary muscles to do the life it needs to live. And I wonder sometimes for us, when we hit tough patches and it seems God is silent, there's something about us having to trust in that moment that grows some sort of spiritual muscle within us. Because if God answers everything the minute we say it, we don't ever really need to trust in his promises, or trust that he is going to be there for us. So I think there's something about developing spiritual muscle. And Ron Williams makes another point about God's silence. He says that God is that environment, that encounter that we will never get to the bottom of, and here's the key thing, that we will never control. To understand that there's something about silence that is profoundly at the heart of being human means to open up to a recognition that being Christian requires us more than ever to come to terms with those moments when silence is imposed on us when we face what we can't control. There's something about silence that means we are no longer in control, because if we pray and God answers the prayer, in some ways you could say we are controlling God. We are effectively making God do what we want. When God doesn't answer our prayers, we're reminded that he doesn't have to. He's in charge, not us. He's in control, not us. So there's sometimes the times of silence remind us that we aren't actually in control, and God isn't there to just jump whenever we want him to. That actually there's a need sometimes for trust and for discipline. But I would encourage you that when it feels like God is silent, you don't have to be. The Psalms make it abundantly clear that when God appears to be silent, that we can cry out to him. And there's something incredibly cathartic about crying out to God about your pain and your struggle and what's going on in your life. Psalm 22 that Jesus quotes on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? He wrestles with the silence. He doesn't just sit there passively. Because that's the other thing. I think when we encounter silence, we need to engage with it. We need to be saying, well, what's actually going on here? What's going on in my heart, my head? How am I dealing with this? How am I coping with this? And most importantly, how am I learning in this time? One writer, writing about the seasons of the soul, talks about the idea of how do we steward our faith in each season? How do we steward our faith when things are a little bit wintry? How do we engage with what God is teaching us? What are we learning in that moment? But the other thing the psalmist is keen to do is make us remember. It's interesting how he goes from, my God, why have you forsaken me? To then thinking about the fact that God had always been there for them in the past. And I think there's something about looking back to God's deliverance in the past, God's faithfulness in the past, God's goodness in the past, that enables us to keep going in the present. A few years ago, many years ago, my family and I went out to Switzerland to visit Marian's sister. And there's a mountain behind their house. And so after lunch one day, we climbed the mountain up into the snow line, and we took a load of sleds with us, and we had fondue. I don't understand fondue. I'm sorry. I know some people really like it, but melted cheese and bread, really? You can do so much better than that. It's not a real meal. I'm sorry. But anyway, fondue aside, for those fondue lovers present, we had fondue, which does sit in your stomach like a lead weight. And then we were due to come down the mountain. It was at that moment we discovered how we were going to get down the mountain. Basically, my brother-in-law had brought a lot of large candles. And so as darkness fell, his great idea was we would each hold a candle, one of these big outdoor candles, and we would toboggan down the hill. Now, it's miles from the top back to their house. It's a very, very long way. So walking down was going to take hours in the darkness. So the kids were obviously very keen on the idea of tobogganing. Now, the key thing about this picture is that's with the flash on. That's with the flash off. So it was pretty dark. So we set off down the mountain, and effectively there's two things you had to remember. One was you just had to keep going in the same direction, assuming you were on the right path, but the other thing you had to do was keep your eyes open for flashes of light, because that would be the person ahead of you. So you would keep going, and then occasionally you would see a flash of light in the distance, and that might mean you needed to change direction. So you were keeping going, and you were looking out for the flashes of light. And that, I think, is a brilliant analogy, if I say so myself, of this phase of faith. Because sometimes when life is tough, we just need to keep going in the same direction. Go back to the basics. Keep on keeping on. Keep doing the things that you normally do. And you very well often find that discipline of just keeping on, builds perseverance, and faith starts to grow. The other thing is to keep looking out for the flashes of light. For those everyday miracles. You may not be seeing the answer, that big answer to prayer that you've been holding on to, that's actually perhaps part of the reason you're in a winter time. And if all you do is focus on the one that hasn't been answered, you miss all the ones that are being answered. You miss what God's doing in other people's lives. And here's the hardest thing of all. Can we learn to rejoice in God answering other people's prayers, even when ours aren't being answered? Can we look for those everyday miracles of what God's doing around us? Because I think, again, going back to the charismatic movement and the types of churches that we're part of, often emotions and experiences become synonymous with faith. We think feeling something means there is something. Whereas in many other Christian traditions, it's got nothing to do with feelings at all. Doing the thing is the thing. You just do the thing, and you keep doing the thing. And I think we can learn something from that we keep on keeping on, that we don't trust our emotions. One writer says famously, doubt your doubts. You can't trust how you feel. So keep on keeping on. Keep feeding yourself with the truth, reading God's word, being around people that can encourage you. And as we do that, I think we begin to build resilience. We begin to build character and faith and all the other things Paul talks about. Why do you think he keeps mentioning in his letters perseverance, resilience, character, all these things, disciplines? Because he knows it's going to be tough. It is going to be hard following Jesus. And so we should expect it, but let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners so that you do not grow weary and lose heart. If our example is Jesus, we shouldn't be surprised when we hit hard times. But at the same time, we look to him and see how he persevered through the hard times. The final myth I encounter talking to people about the winter of faith is this is the end. Because this doesn't feel like it used to, this can't be faith. This can't be the real thing. But what I want to encourage you here today is if you're feeling like that, is this isn't the end, you need to recognise this is Saturday. This is what the disciples experienced on Easter Saturday. They thought it was the end. Jesus was crucified on Friday. They thought it was all done. It was all over. But actually what was happening was something different. Sunday was coming. And here's the thing for us. Sometimes when we go through the winter time of faith, do not expect to go back to the way it was. Jesus always leads us on to something new, to something different. It's going to be a little bit different. It's not about going backwards, it's about going forwards. So the challenge for us is when we're going through those Easter Saturday moments when it seems so difficult, is not to believe this is the end, but to hang on in there and be trusting that Monday is coming. That resurrection happens, but it looks different to what it was before.